Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this talk, which is being brought to you by the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford under the auspices of the Tibetan Studies Initiative that we have here. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today and to welcome our speaker, Christian Luczanits. Dr. Luczanits studied at the University of Vienna in his native Austria and took his PhD there in 1998. And he is an eminent art historian of Indian and Tibetan art who has taught in a number of institutions, first at the University of Vienna, and then he's held a number of visiting appointments at University of California at Berkeley, at the Freie Universität in Berlin, University of California at Santa Barbara, then again at Berkeley, which he held conjointly with a visiting professorship at Stanford University. So he is well known to us here. And so he's taught in a number of places, and he's also been very active in various museum positions and curating various exhibitions, and most notably held a position as advisor at the Rubin Museum of Art in New York until 2014. He is now the David L. Snellgrove Senior Lecturer in Tibetan and Buddhist Art at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. That's a position he's held since September 2014. He is the author of many works on Buddhist art, a monograph, Buddhist Sculpture in Clay, several edited books with other scholars, and a large number of papers which speak to a very wide range of topics and themes in Buddhist art, not only in Tibet, but also in India. And the range of those in chronological terms goes from the beginning of the first millennium of the Common Era right up until around the middle of the second millennium. So a huge chronological range, and also a range in terms of styles and periods and types of art, from Gandharan sculpture right through to Tibetan manuscript art. So a very prolific contribution to the study of Buddhist art and archaeology in various contexts. So we're very happy to have him here today, at least in virtual form, to talk from his latest project, which is connected with the study of Alchi Gompa, which has been a long-term interest of his. So I wish we could welcome you to Stanford in person again, but at least welcome virtually, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. That was kind of a very kind introduction. As you say, I was at Stanford. We worked together, and I also presented several times. And among them, I think also once on Alchi, in a fairly related element, where I kind of talked about the progression of the Alchi monuments and the development of the complex as such. And of course, that work on the development eventually led to a book project, and what I'm presenting today is related to that book project, which I'll introduce shortly. But I'll just get the screen shared. And so what I want to present is some of the kind of new research that came out of the publication project. Obviously, I assume that most of you will be familiar with the place Alchi, which is in Ladakh and or Lower Ladakh more precisely. It's a relatively small village that surprising, or contains a surprising amount of ancient monuments, some of them exceptional. And of course, the famous Sumzek has been published by Roger Göpper. And the publication that I'm talking about essentially complements that volume with the second one that focuses on all the other monuments that Göpper actually hasn't talked about. Here are some figures about the publication, but yeah, it's in the editing process, so I hope it will be out in a few months. I also want to mention that as Göpper's original publication, also this one almost fully depends on the photography of Jaroslav Bonza, who photographed Alchi mostly in the 1980s and early 1990s when he had a project at the site, and we see him here in action. And as said earlier, the only monument that has been studied in great detail is the Alchi Sumzek, the 3-storied building that we see here in an early photograph, also with the top 2 verandas in front of it, kind of making clear that these are kind of 3 superimposed temple structures that were kind of blend here. But the Drikung with its mandalas never really has been studied. And there are kind of good reasons for that. And the main reason being that the mandalas in principle have been identified, and what can one say more about it? And that was certainly one of my kind of research problems. The other one was kind of related to what I said about the development of the complex, namely the interrelationship of the different buildings within Alchi, but now in iconographic terms as well, and how the information that we have that has come down to us through the monuments can be explained and set into a historical context. And here I'm, especially in terms of the architecture, I'm still supported by a team of the Technical University of Graz, which provides all the plans in the publication, and of course also in this presentation. That team is held by Holger Neuwirth, who also did this kind of original study with me on the development of the Alchi Church Core in terms of the historical succession, which I, in the course of this studies, changed slightly, especially the kind of courtyard, the date of the courtyard in front of the main temple. This is just a little map that gives the entirety of the monument. So essentially the book covers all of them, and has a special chapter on the development, kind of expanding on earlier work, as well as kind of specialized chapters like on the Alchi type of mandalas, for example, that became necessary simply because of what I'm talking about today. So what I focus on is new research resulting from it. And when I talk about new research, it goes off a few kind of premises. One is that I tried in this study to understand the relationship of the different topics better. So here is a simple example, this Buddha Shakyamuni representation between the mandalas on the top of the wall, on the right-hand side of the Drikung. How the question here is, how is it related to the other topics, and how can one explain the choice of subject in this particular case? And of course, that question is essentially asked for all of them, which sometimes reveals interesting details about the monuments. The other premise I set myself is to use only textual sources that had a great likelihood to have been known on site by the local scholars at the time when the monuments were built. This actually excludes quite a lot of the sources we regularly use in art history, starting from the Sadhanamala. It also excludes the Vajravali and the Nishpana Yoga Valley, because I found no evidence whatsoever that they were aware of the text and that it was actually used. And it essentially kind of brings one back to the kind of Tibetan canonical literature, of which we know that it has been translated at that time. And that actually turned out to be quite fruitful, to enable to say something new about the mandalas, for example, and resulted in some of the identifications that I talk about. And then there is another premise is, of course, to take the aspirations that are expressed in the inscriptions and in the depictions by the people who actually made the monument seriously, and kind of try to bring those in the foreground. And that brings me to kind of the first theme that I want to discuss as a kind of aspect of new research, namely, what can we say about the social context within which Alchi and its monuments were built, and how does that relate to other monuments of early Tibetan art with which we always compare the monument itself. And I think that is an interesting aspect that changed at least my idea of what Alchi is to some extent. Then I can offer, from essentially scouring the Tibetan canon for different iconographic forms, I can offer some new identifications, including the famous green Tara, which I think is quite certainly to be identified as Mahashanti Tara, which is a well-known deity, but not in a green form, only in a white form. And I'll talk about that in some detail. And then I'll talk about the Dharmadhatu mandala, which is an extremely important topic, and the importance of which I think the literature doesn't actually explain. And so I kind of try to do that in the publication. And closely related to it is an entire group of depictions that relate to the litany of names of Manjushri, the Manjushri Namasangiti, and sometimes kind of directly derive from it. And so that's another kind of interesting aspect of this. And altogether allow me to kind of maybe more precisely define the relationship of the Alchi monument to the Drikung school, about which we, or at least I personally, have no doubt that it was kind of closely involved, but how exactly, I think, is the question in this case. I'm sure most of you will be familiar, but I thought I'll talk about Alchi and the relationship to the different classes of Tantra as a kind of introduction, because we need it to discuss some of the themes later on. And I have a kind of very simplistic kind of summary here that points out that Alchi is really at the threshold from the Yoga Tantras to the higher Yoga Tantras as public topics. And of course, the big distinction is that what Alchi is mostly focused on are Yoga Tantra topics, like the Vajradhatu mandala, the Dharmadhatu mandala that I mentioned, the mandalas from the Sarvadurgati Parishodhana Tantra, mandalas of Prajnaparamita that quite certainly are to be interpreted as kind of yoga tantra topics in this context, and there is no kind of explicit sexual symbolism in the representations of Alchi. Obviously, this is based on the 5 Buddha system, the 5 esoteric Buddhas, as they are kind of described and characterized in the Savadadagada Tattva Sangraha Tantra, and then depicted in early tantras. And of course, in the early conception of these 5 Buddhas, the Vairochana is the primus inter pares, the one, actually more than that, he is the deity or the Buddha who contains the other ones. So the others are really just aspects of it. But this is something that over time gets diluted in the Tibetan tradition. And of course, at the same time, we know that Tibetan Buddhists knew highest Yoga Tantra texts, had translated them, but did not necessarily depict them. And Alchi is really at the threshold insofar that depictions of deities in Yabyum, so to speak, in sexual embrace, are not found in the earliest monuments, but are then found in the so-called Lakang Soma. And Lakang Soma for Sarma, new, I think may well refer to the new schools which promoted these teachings in the Tibetan Buddhist context, and also in a public form. And so it's not surprising that it's for the first time depicted there. But that the Alchi monuments themselves are at the very threshold of this transition from the Yoga Tantras to the Anuttara Yoga Tantras, I already focused on when I talked about the kind of chronology of the Alchi monuments and their development, and how that development relates to the Buddha Vairochana and Akshobhya, how kind of Akshobhya is actually quite prominent within that context. But there are kind of major differences in some of the conceptions as they are expressed in the earlier Alchi monuments and the later Alchi monuments. And we see that best on a comparison of the Vajradhatu mandala in an early conception and in a late conception. In the early conception that we see on the left, Vairochana is surrounded by the 4 goddesses that are the mothers of the families. So this is the concept where Vairochana really encompasses and implicitly generates the families around them and incorporates all the Buddhas. Yeah? This conception is depicted in the representation on the left through the goddesses being represented by the symbols of the families only in the corners around Vairochana. Yeah? In the later conception, that is for the first time kind of visible in the Alchi Sumtsek, the goddesses are attached as consorts to the Buddhas. And this is, of course, a concept that is inherited from the Guhya Samaja Tantra. And we see the distinction not only in the fact that the goddesses moved out into the corner spaces of the central square, but also through the fact that they have taken on the color of the kind of Buddha that they are associated with, and that one of the Buddhas has no associated consort, because that wasn't possible to build into the kind of original geometric form of the mandala. And so in the example on the right, you'll see that Luczanits is associated with Vairochana, and that there is no consort of the color blue. So Akshobhya is, in this case, without consorts, and the kind of commentators find different solutions around that problem. But it's clear that by that stage, Vairochana wasn't the supreme Buddha in that sense anymore, and he was superseded by an Adi Buddha, an even higher one. Another topic in Alchi that kind of demonstrates the threshold position of this particular monument are, of course, the 80 Mahasiddhas, or 80 plus, as I call them now, because there is one particular group that really ends with 80. And then, of course, there's the popular group of 84 that are here for the first time represented. So even if, and as I do, one dates the Alchi Sumtsek into the 1220s, the early, or around 1220, the early 13th century, this is still the earliest representation of the topic that we have. Yeah, and actually an 11th century date would assume that it comes before the actual textual sources that we have about that topic. And one of the questions in that relation that I had to kind of reconcile myself with is, what is the function of this naked black Siddha here, who is so prominently represented on that dhoti? And I think in the meantime, I follow the proposal of, I think Rob Linroth originally proposed that this is Padamba, but I'm kind of now fairly confident of that as well. And I would explain that as that he is represented here in his symbolic function of bringing the esoteric Buddhist tradition to Tibet, because he died in 1117 in Tibet. And then, of course, you have with Alchi the first Western Himalayan monuments, chronologically speaking, that actually have a Mahakala representation above the door. And this form of Mahakala, again, is associated with the highest Yoga Tantras and with Akshobhya as the primary Buddha. And not surprisingly, a Vajra deity-focused mandala is represented above him. And in the same way, the emphasis on Akshobhya's paradise is probably not just kind of abhirati, but probably something more than that. Yeah, I think it's the combination of paradise for rebirth, but also the tantric function of Akshobhya and his Vajra family. And we'll see that on the left side, that you have Akshobhya's paradise above and the tantric priests in the bottom row underneath. And one can interpret them as part of that assembly. One could also interpret them as part of an assembly relating to a deity at the side, but it's definitely no accident that they are brought together. So I think that gives you an idea about the way I think about the monument in terms of the broad position within the development of Tibetan Buddhist art, and especially in its public presentation. What the topics now really focus on is where does Alchi sit in terms of, the development of the monastic community, for example, in terms of social context, or the development of certain Buddhist or certain iconographies and mandalas within the Tibetan Buddhist context. And I think what I realized relatively late in the process on working on the publication is that we tend to see kind of, Alchi in a similar light as Tabo, as a kind of, because it's such an important, such a high quality monument, we think, or we will just take it as one other piece of evidence of some mainstream tradition, which I think is maybe misleading in some way. Yeah, because it's the context in which Alchi was built is very clearly completely different from that in Tabo, which clearly is a royal monument. And in Tabo we have Yeshe depicted in the foundation phase, 996. We have Changjub and his inscription recording a renovation. So it's very clear that the West Tibetan royal house was involved in its making. Alchi was always puzzling because we don't have that relationship. Also, we always expected it, and the local tradition associating all these early monuments with Rinchen Sangpo makes us believe that as well. But actually, it's not the case. It's a purely local production. It's a local production by family members of a clan that is a central Tibetan clan, but that, as we learned from a kind of new study of an inscription, essentially come from West Tibet, but were already established for at least 3 or 4 generations in Ladakh at the stage when Alchi was built. And so it's not, so what we see here is the foundation, or one of, maybe what one could call the foundation inscription within the donor depiction of the Alchi Drikung, that probably shows the founder of the temple, Khalden Sherab, kind of leading the monastic community of the site. And I think once the number of monks of that community may well be realistic, that they weren't probably more at the very beginning. And you'll see in a minute why I think so. And obviously we know that they have this distinctive monastic robes that they wear in the Alchi monument. But one of the kind of more exciting discoveries of the research, which really didn't focus on the inscription, was that actually the Sumtsek as well has a foundation inscription that wasn't recognized as such. And so if we look at this Maitreya image from the middle floor, we'll have this beam that is inscribed with 2 different texts that then would transcribed. And to the side, on the side wall of the niche, we have the beginning of an inscription that Amy Heller, for example, uses in her interpretation of the monument. But this is only the beginning of an inscription that then runs between the painting all along that side. And it's that part that hasn't been read before. Yeah, and of this inscription, really only the beginning and the end have been read, while this middle part hasn't been read. And what it tells us is essentially a genealogy of the local founders, leading up to Tsultim, the founder of this particular monument. Yeah, what's a little puzzling is it doesn't actually also directly link back to Khalden Sherab. Yeah, so the insecurity, how these two are related, is still a question, but we assume that he was the uncle of Tsultimö. Yeah, and that the last ancestor mentioned here is that uncle. And this particular section that I singled out here just shows you the poor condition of the text itself. So it actually takes quite a lot of effort to figure it out. The person who actually studied it, and I'll publish the translation of that in the publication, is Niels Martin, a kind of advanced graduate student from Paris, who kind of made it one of his kind of main tasks, reading the inscriptions that are difficult to read in the region, besides his art historical work. And in the second row from the bottom on this particular slide, we actually have the section where it more or less says that that the nephew of this one is the Lelopburn, the scholar Zultimö, yeah, and then it goes on and tells about his particular achievements, and that's essentially how this inscription is organized. So we have at least kind of 4 generations mentioned or referred to, probably leading from the late 11th century into the 12th century. And there is also a gap in the record. Interestingly enough, I myself kind of restudied the inscription that is written by Zultimö himself in the Great Stupa, which I now call the Baldendrepung because that's one of the Churton that Zultimö says he built himself. And currently a full study of that inscription with transcription, the Tibetan text, which I think we have to do for the Ladakis so that they read it, and a translation is currently in press. This is just a small section that shows that those kind of parts that Göpper regarded as historically insignificant are actually still tell us a lot about the kind of cultural context in which this particular foundation was made. But this work was kind of initiated by another kind of discovery about this inscription that I bring in at the end of this presentation. And then, of course, I wanted to point out here in terms of social context that if we'll take the donor depiction of the Alchi Drikung as a whole, the so-called, the famous drinking scene that is always singled out as the donor depiction of Alchi is actually kind of marginal within that, yeah, and probably represents the kind of next step level of royalty, local royalty, yeah. But the culture represented by the founders themselves is the same as those of that royalty. But Niels Martin suggested that for Mangyu, that there are kind of 2 levels of rulership that are represented. So the local rulers referring to the in what I think the higher Ladakhi rulers means Ngari Kosum. The 3 dominions of Ngari were essentially 3 independent realms. What we have as historical texts or documented through historical texts is the West Tibetan realm. And my assumption is that this doesn't refer, that the Alchi evidence does not refer to the West Tibetan realm. It refers to the Ladakhi realm, to which of course is one of the 3 realms of Ngari, to which the later Ladakhi kingdom still references itself back to, yeah, and that can't be an accident. So otherwise, why wouldn't, if there wouldn't be already a high degree of independence, why would they kind of not refer themselves back to the West Tibetan kings directly? And so, yeah, I think that's about that. So altogether then, what it means for the foundation of the Alchi Drikung and the development of the Alchi monuments is that we have to see it as a family monastery, as a kind of family foundation of the Zhou family. And this becomes even more apparent if we compare Alchi with Mangyu, which is one of the kind of other comparative monuments. While Alchi is founded by the Zhou family, Mangyu is founded by the Mer family, by the Smer clan. Yeah, and it's very clear that the priests between those, the monks among those families, compete with each other in terms of how to depict the mandalas correctly, because there is a stunning divergence between the representations at these two sites. And I think that gives us a much better idea in how much we can rely on the iconography of the monuments, and in how much they must kind of reflect mainstream developments within Tibetan Buddhism. And one reason, or I'll set that the 6 or 7 monks that are represented in the donor inscription are already, or probably the entire monastic community at its foundations. And if you are there, it's a 4-pillar building or a 4-pillar assembly hall. And we see here the benches as they looked like in the 1980s. You can just fit like 4 monks on each side, and that's the assembly hall. Yeah, and so it's just a relatively small monument, and it probably ran out of space soon, because as I read the courtyard extension in front of the main temple now, is that it was an expansion of the sacred space, and for that reason the Bhava Chakra and the cosmos depiction and the protectors above the door are again found at the entrance of the courtyard and have been replaced on the veranda side by other topics. And that expansion is probably only 50 years after the foundation, and essentially reflects the expansion or the early expansion of the monument. So in terms of new identifications, I just want to focus on 2 examples. The mandalas I'll talk later about, part of that, of course, as well. And I want to particularly talk about this Mahashantitara that is represented both in the Sumtsek, that's the famous representation. What we see here is the earlier representation of that goddess in the Drikung. And both representations are iconographically highly precise. And if you read the description of Mahashantitara, among the 21 taras that are the sadhanas of which are collected in a number of texts, the iconographic description is almost identical, with including the position of the hands and the attributes. But what doesn't fit is the color of the goddess. She's described white, and I think this is the reason why nobody actually got the idea to identify her with it. But she is also described as holding a nutpala, a blue lily. And of course, we know that the lotus is the flower of Tara, and the blue lily is the flower of green Tara. Yeah, so it's the flower that she holds actually is one hint that there must have been an independent form of that Tara that was green, that we don't have the text of anymore. And another element that kind of gives her a location where she may have been prominent, namely Kashmir, is the attribute of a tridanda that she holds in her upper right hand. is a stick with 3 ends that eventually gets kind of reinterpreted as a staff or club, and because it's not understood as such, but it's very clear what it represents. And so she seems to have been kind of or popular at the time. And so when we see a configuration like the 5 taras in the Sumtsek, this is almost like a miniature form of the 21 taras, but within that, the Mahashanti takes the main position. And she appears to be worshipped for all kinds of things, but including better rebirth. Here we'll see the Tridanda more clearly, and one of the elements she is associated with, and I didn't emphasize that here, is the nectar of immortality. And I think for that reason, behind the priest on the right side, there is this huge flask with a white body inside, so filled with that nectar. And for the same reason, these flasks are also found with both of the donors in the Sumtsek. And so I think she simply was a popular deity locally at that time, that obviously the independent cult of which eventually kind of disappeared, or was considered non-canonically and was kind of weeded out. That's the other possibility. Another information in terms of new identification that is provided by the foundation inscription in the Sumtsek is there are a few short iconographic descriptions or general descriptions pertaining to the temple, and it clarifies that the deity assembly in the niche of Avalokiteshvara is an Amogapasha assembly, and is clearly interpreted as such. And that, of course, helps to set the context for Amogapasha's assemblies in that kind of cultural context more broadly, because obviously there is quite some diversity in that. So if we'll move on to the Dharmadhatu mandala, the Vajradhatu mandala is, of course, the most important topic in the cella of the Drikung, and is the most important topic in all the related monuments. But in most of the early Western Himalayan monuments, the Dharmadhatu Vagishvara Manjushri mandala takes the second most important position, directly to the left of the main one. Yeah, and I think nobody really looked at that in detail. Here we have the example at Nako in that same position. Here we have the Vajradhatu and the Dharmadhatu representation in Sumda Chung in the same position. And Sumda Chung, or Sumda more broadly, is mentioned as the original place of the founders of Alchi. And here we have it on the ceiling in Dunka. So I think it's such a prominent topic. But actually, we haven't studied it in detail, and I think it's still understudied. And looking at the kind of iconography of the mandala and trying to understand how it works, it seems to become clear that it kind of works as a representation of the complete bodhisattva path. What I mean with it is that in the center, what we have is essentially, within the Yoga Tantras, an interpretation that already includes highest Yoga Tantra concepts. And the element that I talked about with the consorts and their relationship to the Buddhas is already found here, with the distinction that now the the goddess that in the Sumtsek mandala is attributed to Ratnasambhava is here attributed to Akshobhya so you have this relationship across the whole inner palace. But then, interestingly enough, the goddesses in the next quarter are actually different qualities that a bodhisattva attains during his career. The different at the bottom in the east are the different stages, the bhumis, which are expanded to a set of 12. In the on the south side are the paramitas, again expanded to a set of 12. On the west side, we have the powers or the powers that bodhisattva or controls that a bodhisattva gains, the Vashitas that a bodhisattva gains during his career. And in the north here, just kind of framed by the red rectangle, are the dharanis. And so the Tantric path is kind of built into the bodhisattva path here that is represented through these goddesses. Yeah, and so we can say that the Dharmadhatu mandala not only includes the entire bodhisattva path, but also includes crucially the highest yoga tantras. And so the Dharmadhatu mandala is in a way for the West Tibetan, for the conservative West Tibetan environment, the possibility to essentially teach Guhya Samaja doctrine under a yoga tantra heading, so to speak. Yeah, and I think in this very same function, this particular mandala was already represented in Thabo, in the assembly hall. And actually, I've identified all the deities of that mandala there now. Yeah, the other one is the other important topic is the Namasangiti. And of course, that was already well known through these four-armed forms of Avalokiteshvara that take such a prominent position within the Alchi monuments, not only in the form of this Manjushri in the Sumtsek, but also in the form that he occurs in the Manjushri temple itself and on the walls flanking it. But in this particular context, he is really related to the highest Yoga Tantra teachings, as the Mahasiddhas on the Dhoti indicate. And I think this particular interpretation is a particular interpretation of the litany of names of Manjushri under a highest Yoga Tantra perspective. And I already said that the role of Padmasambhava, of Padampa-Sangye in this particular context is the transmission of the highest Yoga Tantra teachings to Tibet. And in that same role within Alchi, he is represented at the very end of the 80 Mahasiddhas that are shown there. And he is clearly outside the 80 Mahasiddhas. So at the very bottom row, in the middle, where the crack is coming down, on the one side is the last siddha of the group that rides an elephant, and the first following is Padampa-Sangye. Yeah, so you have the kind of Tibetan continuation of an Indian siddha tradition that is represented through them. The advantage here is that it's actually inscribed, that the names of the deities are actually inscribed, and also the distinction between the two groups is made. That Manjushri is associated or interpreted in this context, in the highest Yoga Tantra context, is also indicated by the deity that is represented above his head in the very top of the niche. That but don't ask me which deity it is. I can't actually identify it. It seems to merge elements of Akshobhya Vajra and Akshobhya in the Dharmadhatu Vagishvara Manjushri mandala. And so it's a very curious iconography that still needs more explanation. But it's very clear that it's kind of interpreted under the highest yoga or under highest yoga tantra concept. And then we also have the specific Vajradhatu mandala that derives from the litany of names of Manjushri. And there I made this interesting discovery, which I thought would not be possible, that these two mandalas that represent different main deities and have quite some differences in the representation of the secondary deities are actually the same. Yeah, they represent the same mandala. In the one case, we have Vairochana in Bodhiagri Mudra in the center, and all the secondary deities, except the Buddhas, actually hold in the more prominent right hand that usually holds the main attribute, they hold a sword. Yeah, and I think that sword references Manjushri in this case, and the second attribute is their distinctive attribute in the Vajradhatu mandala. In the other version, we actually have a form of Manjushri in the center that replaced Vairochana and is called Adi-Buddha. And so to make it clear that it's Manjushri Adi-Buddha who appears on the heart of Vairochana in the visualization of the Manjushri Namasangiti. So now, because they use in the Sumtsek, they actually use Adi-Buddha as the main deity. And we earlier always thought this is a kind of, an odd variant of the Dharmadhatu Vagishvara Manjushri, but it's actually the combination of the 5 Buddhas in one Manjushri, where all of them hold swords and books. Yeah. And what that means is that in this particular representation of that mandala, the secondary deities don't need to hold the sword, because the hint that it is the Namasangiti Vajradhatu mandala is already there through the main deity. And so I think in the one case, the swords serve to hint towards Manjushri. Here it's the main deity itself that replaced Vairochana. And this is, of course, in the same context. We have it in the Alchi Drikung and in the Alchi Sumtsek. And in the Sumtsek, it's the main mandala of the monument on the top floor. And the same deity, this Manjushri Adi-Buddha, is also represented in the Maitreya niche in the back corner, the large deity that kind of can be faintly seen with the 5 hands, in this case, holding the swords. Is the same deity, and it makes the link from the ground floor to the top floor. This brings me to my last point, the relationship to the Drikung school. And it was, of course, always puzzling that the Drikung lineage, as it is placed in the top floor, is kind of always a bit of an afterthought. And I think both the unusual stylistic characteristics, then unusual elements in the inscriptions have led many scholars to doubt the authenticity and the time period in which this was painted. I think it's the new topic that makes it appear unusual. And I think the inscriptions are perfectly fine within them. Tsultim takes refuge to each lama of the lineage. And that's what is said in the kind of middle row that you see in the inscription above, that I, Gelong Tsultim and the was forgotten. And so it's added on top and so on, take refuge to. And then you have the different teachers listed, and it goes down and ends with Drikungpa. Yeah, clearly these are not perfectly written inscriptions, but they have been added at the very top of that monument, directly opposite the main theme that clearly references highest yoga tantras. In addition, that particular lineage contains the names of two lineage holders which are not usually found in the lineages. And we know from later Tibetan lineages that kind of in the immediate historical past of a teacher, he may consider other teachers as kind of crucial for his spiritual development, which later tradition weeds out. Yeah, and so what those who think this is a much later inscription, of course, don't explain why these two additional teachers would be there in this case, if this would be like some people stated 16th century addition to that monument. Yeah, then there would be absolutely no reason to essentially include Tagpo and Tagpo and Chungwa or Tagpo Gom Sherab Chung, the successors of Gampopa as abbots of Tagla Gampo. Yeah, and so it just doesn't make sense. But what I discovered when I looked at the inscription of the Great Stupa again is that actually that inscription refers to Drikung as well, and it's actually dedicated to him. And so in the fourth verse, taking refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, then the fourth verse takes refuge or praises the Drikungpa. And what is underlined in red, yeah, that's the line that I've underlined in red as well in the inscription below, in my transcription below. And what is very clear is the Je, so that there is a person that is referred to. The Dri is not clear, the Gung is clear again, and the Gung has been read as Sung, and the previous syllables haven't been read in the first edition of Roger Göpper, and nobody seems to have looked at it in that detail again. Yeah, so unfortunately, whoever read it for him at that time, that particular section was misread, which also means that the meaning of the inscription remained unclear, because once you know to whom it is dedicated, many other sections within the inscription become much more clear. Yeah, and especially that each time that he refers to a Rinpoche, you know to whom he is referring to. And what that inscription then also makes clear is that it mentions within the same verse, it mentions that he founded the Sumtsek, which was known, but also a Dungkang for the Rinpoche, so a kind of funerary monument for him, which kind of makes me to think the most likely place where that funerary monument is the original stupa within the Sumtsek, and that the entire building was actually dedicated to him. The fact that this is not mentioned in the foundation of inscription of the Sumtsek itself is, I think, explainable by the fact that this particular inscription in the Balden Trebung is written by Tsultimur himself, who is a devout follower of Chikling Gampo, while the other inscription is really a praise of his genealogy, yeah, not written by himself, and it actually talks about the family and not about and what they built, but not really about their spiritual background, so to speak, which is very clear for the Balden Trebung stupa inscription. And so it's what we have kind of concluded earlier on the basis of the representations of the teacher in the Great Churton and earlier in the Small Churton particularly, that they refer to early Drikung painting is just confirmed by that inscription. And it gives us a better idea about kind of the religious context of the time. But what it doesn't mean, so what it means is that Zültimö, as the local family priest, was a follower of Drikungpa. Yeah, we don't know if he ever met him, but he obviously was close enough to gain some form of relic for which he can build a Dungkang. Yeah, which is remarkable in itself. But what it doesn't mean is probably what is the most contentious element today, namely that this makes, or that this makes Alchi a Drikung monument. That probably it never was. It was only a family monastery led by priests who inherited from uncle to nephew, led by local priests that essentially adhered to or became pupils of prominent teachers of their time. Yeah, and Drikungpa obviously was a prominent teacher of their time. Yeah, and in this sense, yeah, we're extremely fortunate, and that this family was so rich to employ Vishwakarman in the decoration of their monuments and give us such a kind of rich cultural background for the monument, which in my opinion clearly reflect Ladakhi culture of the time, but also of course tie in the bigger picture of the development of Tibetan Buddhism, but that shouldn't kind of direct the interpretation of the monument itself. Thank you.